The sledgehammer hit the wooden railing with a sickening crack that echoed across the water like a gunshot. I stood frozen on my back porch, coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching 5 men in hard hats systematically destroy the bridge my grandfather built with his own hands 60 years ago. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice breaking as I ran toward them. "You can't do this." Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The man with the sledgehammer paused, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Behind him, Margaret Hensley, the iron-fisted president of our Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I'm afraid we can. The bridge is a safety hazard and violates 17 different HOA regulations. We've been more than patient." Patient? I wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat like broken glass. They'd been patient for exactly 30 days, ever since I'd refused to sell my property to Hensley's son-in-law's development company for half its value. I watched helplessly as another swing of the hammer sent a piece of the railing spinning into the lake below. Each impact felt like a blow to my chest. This wasn't just wood and nails they were destroying, it was my childhood, my heritage, my connection to the man who'd raised me after my parents died. "Please," I whispered, but my voice was lost in the sound of splintering wood. The bridge had been Grandpa Joe's masterpiece. He'd spent an entire summer when I was 8 years old, teaching me how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive nails without bending them, how to treat wood so it would last for generations. We'd worked side by side in the humid Tennessee heat, him telling me stories about his father and his father's father, all while creating something that would connect our property to the small island in the middle of Willowbrook Lake where he'd built me a treehouse. "It's not just a bridge, Tommy," he'd said, ruffling my hair with his calloused hands. "It's a promise. A promise that some things in this world are built to last, built with love, built to bring people together instead of keeping them apart." Now, 30 years after his death, I was watching that promise being broken with every swing of Margaret Hensley's hired demolition crew. "The paperwork is all in order," Margaret continued, waving a manila folder. "Emergency demolition order. The bridge is structurally unsound and poses a danger to the community." "Bullshit," I shouted, my usual politeness finally snapping. "That bridge has weathered every storm for 60 years. I just had it inspected 6 months ago. It's solid as a rock." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Thompson, your language is inappropriate and your inspection is irrelevant. The HOA commissioned its own structural analysis, and the results were concerning." I knew she was lying. Everything about her posture, her tone, the way she avoided my eyes, it all screamed deception. But what could I do? I was one man against an entire HOA board, one voice against a chorus of neighbors who'd been systematically turned against me over the past year. It had started small, the way these things always do. A complaint about my grass being a quarter-inch too long. A citation for leaving my trash cans out 15 minutes past the designated pickup time. Warnings about the non-conforming color of my mailbox, which had been the same forest green for 15 years without a single complaint until Margaret took over as HOA president. But I knew what this was really about. 3 months ago, her son-in-law, Brad Carlisle, had approached me with an offer to buy my 2-acre lakefront property for $300,000. The land was worth at least $750,000, probably more, and I told him exactly what he could do with his lowball offer. That's when the harassment began in earnest. Suddenly, every aspect of my property was under microscopic scrutiny. The bridge, which had been grandfathered in under the original HOA agreement when the neighborhood was developed around my family's existing homestead, was now somehow a safety hazard and aesthetic blight. "You have 1 hour to remove any personal items from the island," Margaret announced, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "After that, the area will be off-limits pending further HOA review." The treehouse. She was going to take away access to Grandpa's treehouse too. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not sadness anymore, but rage. Pure, crystalline rage. "Fine," I said, my voice deadly quiet. 1 hour. I turned away from the destruction, ignoring Margaret's triumphant smile, and walked back to my house. But I wasn't giving up. Not by a long shot. The treehouse looked smaller than I remembered, but it was still solid. Grandpa had built it to last just like everything else. I climbed the wooden ladder slowly, each rung bringing back memories of summer afternoons spent reading comic books and dreaming about the future. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it after my last visit 6 months ago. The old camping chair where I'd spent countless hours thinking through life's problems. The wooden chest containing childhood treasures and, more importantly, all of Grandpa's old papers and photographs. I'd stored them here years ago when I renovated the main house, thinking the treehouse was the safest place for precious memories. Now I was grateful for that decision. I packed everything carefully into waterproof containers, my hands shaking with barely controlled fury as the sound of splintering would continue below. That's when I found it. Tucked behind a loose board that had warped over the years was a manila envelope I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of photographs and documents dating back to the 1940s, all in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Property surveys, water rights documentation, and something that made my blood run cold, correspondence with the county about a waste disposal permit for the land that eventually became Willowbrook Lake. The lake wasn't natural. It had been a quarry, then a landfill, then flooded to create the artificial lake when the housing development was built in the 1980s. But according to these documents, not everything had been properly remediated before the flooding. One letter, dated 1978, was particularly damning. It was from a county environmental official to my grandfather, warning that several drums of industrial waste had been temporarily stored in the old quarry and would need to be removed before any flooding could take place. Grandpa's handwritten response was attached. He'd been promised the waste would be removed within 6 months. But the lake had been flooded in 1979. I took pictures of everything with my phone, my mind racing. Why had Grandpa kept these documents secret? Had he tried to report this? The answer came in the form of another letter, this one from a lawyer, advising him that whistleblower protections were limited and that he could face significant personal liability if he pursued the matter. My grandfather, the most honest man I'd ever known, had been silenced by legal threats and bureaucratic intimidation. But he'd kept the evidence, hidden it away, perhaps hoping that someday someone would be able to use it. That someone was me. The bridge was gone. I stood on my dock 2 hours later, staring at the naked pilings jutting from the water like broken teeth. 60 years of craftsmanship reduced to splinters floating on the surface of the lake. The demolition crew had been thorough. They'd even removed the metal brackets that had anchored the bridge to my dock. Margaret stood on the shore, directing 2 men who were installing a new sign, "Private HOA property, and no trespassing violators will be prosecuted." "Enjoying the view?" she called out with mock concern. "I know change can be difficult, but you'll adjust. The community looks so much cleaner already." I didn't respond. I was too busy calculating water volume and drainage rates in my head. You see, there was one thing Margaret didn't know about Willowbrook Lake. One thing the entire HOA had apparently forgotten in their rush to control every aspect of the neighborhood. The lake might have been created artificially, but it was fed by a natural spring on my property. The same spring that had drawn my great-grandfather to build his homestead here in the first place. More importantly, I controlled the water rights. Those rights had been grandfathered in when the housing development was built, just like the bridge had been. The difference was they destroyed my bridge, but they couldn't destroy a legal document filed with the county recorder's office. I spent the rest of the day researching, making phone calls, and planning. The documents from the treehouse had given me ammunition, but I needed more than historical evidence. I needed leverage. It took 3 days to find the right lawyer, someone with experience in environmental law and, more importantly, someone who wasn't afraid of taking on a wealthy HOA with deep pockets. Jessica Martinez was a bulldog in designer suits, fresh off a major victory against a chemical company that had been illegally dumping waste in rural communities. "This is explosive," she said, spreading the copied documents across her desk. "If there really are industrial waste drums at the bottom of this lake, the EPA cleanup costs alone could bankrupt the entire development. Not to mention the health risks to residents who've been swimming in and fishing from contaminated water for 30 years. How do we prove it's still down there?" I asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that had probably made chemical company executives break out in cold sweats. "We drained the lake. The paperwork took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Margaret Hensley and her HOA cronies celebrating their victory, posting on social media about removing eyesores and maintaining property values. 2 weeks of neighbors avoiding eye contact when I walked to my mailbox, either from shame or smugness, I couldn't tell which. But Jessica Martinez was a woman of her word. On a sunny Tuesday morning in October, she arrived with a court order, 3 EPA investigators, and a team of hydrologists. "Mr. Thompson has legally invoked his water rights," she announced to the growing crowd of confused homeowners. "As the holder of the original spring rights predating this development, he has the authority to redirect the water source for environmental testing purposes." Margaret Hensley's face went from tan to pale to an alarming shade of purple. "You can't do this. That lake is community property. I'll sue you into the Stone Age. Actually, Jessica replied calmly, consulting her tablet, the lake exists entirely at the sufferance of Mr. Thompson's water rights. According to county records, if the spring water is diverted, there's no legal obligation to maintain the artificial lake level. The HOA never secured independent water rights when the development was built, a rather significant oversight. I stood beside my lawyer, trying to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was singing. This was better than I dared hope. Not only could I drain the lake to expose whatever was hidden at the bottom, but it was completely legal. The hydrologists worked quickly. By afternoon, they'd installed a bypass system that redirected the spring water away from the lake and into the natural creek bed it had followed for thousands of years before the development was built. The lake level began dropping immediately. "This is temporary, right?" asked Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down. She was one of the few neighbors who'd always been kind to me, who'd brought casseroles after Grandpa died and never complained when my grass grew a little long. "That depends on what we find," I told her honestly. "But don't worry, Mrs. Patterson. If the lake is clean, the water will be back." I just didn't mention that if the lake wasn't clean, her house and everyone else's would probably be uninhabitable. It took 6 days for the lake to drain enough to reveal its secrets. On the morning of the 7th day, I stood with Jessica, the EPA investigators, and half the neighborhood, staring at an environmental nightmare that had been hidden under 30 feet of water for over 4 decades. The drums were there. Dozens of them, rusted and leaking, scattered across the old quarry floor like toxic Easter eggs. Some were partially buried in sediment, others had split open entirely, their contents long since dissolved into the ecosystem. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of rotting fish, industrial chemicals, and something sweet and cloying that made your eyes water. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the bones. Not human bones, at least I hope not, but the skeletal remains of countless fish, birds, and small animals that had died over the years from chemical poisoning. They were embedded in the toxic sediment like a macabre museum display, a testament to 3 decades of cover-up and willful ignorance. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the EPA investigators, a grizzled man who'd seen everything during his 20-year career. "How did no one notice the fish kills? The smell? The obvious signs of contamination." Margaret Hensley stood 20 feet away, her face ashen, clutching her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. She'd been conspicuously silent since the first drums were exposed. "Mrs. Hensley," Jessica Martinez called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd just won the environmental lawsuit of the century. "As HOA president, were you aware of any documentation regarding the lake's construction history?" No, we inherited all the HOA files when I took over, but I never." Margaret's voice trailed off as she realized she was potentially admitting to criminal negligence. But I knew better. The timing was too convenient, the harassment too targeted. Margaret hadn't just known about the contamination, she'd been actively working to cover it up. My refusal to sell had threatened not just her son-in-law's development plans, but the entire house of cards they'd built over this toxic secret. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I think Mrs. Hensley knew exactly what was down here. The photos I'd taken of Grandpa's documents were still there, but more importantly, I'd spent the past week doing my own research. Property records, HOA board meeting minutes, correspondence with the county planning office. It was all a matter of public record if you knew where to look." "Margaret Hensley has been HOA president for 5 years, I continued, enjoying the way she flinched at every word. "During that time, she's consistently blocked any proposals for lake improvements, environmental testing, or infrastructure updates that might have required draining the lake. She's also been the primary advocate for purchasing my property, which happens to control the water rights that made today's discovery possible." Jessica Martinez was already taking notes, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of an even bigger case. "Are you suggesting Mrs. Hensley was aware of the contamination and actively worked to conceal it?" "I'm suggesting that a woman who reads every HOA regulation down to the font size probably didn't overlook the environmental impact studies that should have been conducted before any lake improvements. Studies that would have revealed this contamination years ago." Margaret finally found her voice. "That's ridiculous. I'm a retired teacher, not an environmental scientist. How was I supposed to know about some industrial waste from 40 years ago?" But her protest sounded hollow, especially when Jessica pulled out her own tablet and began reading from HOA board meeting minutes. "August 15th, 3 years ago, Jessica announced, quote, President Hensley expressed concerns about proposed lake aeration system, citing potential disruption of lake bottom sediments and unknown environmental factors. Motion to table indefinitely. End quote. The crowd around us had grown to include most of the neighborhood. Faces I'd seen at HOA meetings, neighbors who'd voted to approve my harassment, people who'd celebrated the destruction of my bridge just 2 weeks ago. Now they were all staring at Margaret Hensley with a mixture of horror and betrayal. September 10th, 2 years ago, Jessica continued. Quote, President Hensley recommended against fish stocking program pending environmental assessment that was never commissioned. January 22nd, last year, President Hensley blocked proposal for community dock improvements citing soil stability concerns. Each quote hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her husband was now openly staring at her, his face a mask of confusion and dawning realization. You knew, he whispered. Margaret, you knew about this the whole time. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, the EPA had declared the entire development a Superfund site. Property values didn't just drop. They became negative numbers as homeowners faced the prospect of paying for environmental remediation that could cost millions of dollars. Margaret Hensley was arrested on charges of environmental fraud, conspiracy, and criminal negligence. It turned out she'd been receiving payments from the same development company that had originally built Willowbrook Estates, payments to keep quiet about what they'd buried under the lake. The other HOA board members claimed ignorance, and mostly I believed them. They'd been Margaret's puppets, following her lead because she seemed so competent, so thorough, so concerned about property values. They never questioned why she was so opposed to any activities that might disturb the lake bottom. My neighbors' reactions were mixed. Some apologized, sheepishly admitting they'd gotten caught up in HOA politics and peer pressure. Others blamed me for destroying the neighborhood by exposing the contamination, as if I'd somehow created the problem by revealing it. But Mrs. Patterson brought me another casserole and a bottle of wine. I always thought that bridge was beautiful, she said quietly. Your grandfather would be proud of you for standing up to them. The cleanup took 8 months. 8 months of hazmat crews, soil remediation, and EPA oversight. 8 months of living in a construction zone while they excavated 40 years of toxic waste and replaced it with clean fill. The lake came back eventually. Cleaner than it had been in decades, fed by the crystal-clear spring that had been running free during the cleanup. The new lake was smaller. The EPA had insisted on a larger buffer zone between the water and the houses, but it was actually beautiful now, instead of being a pretty lie covering an ugly truth. I built a new bridge. Not exactly where the old one had been. The EPA restrictions meant I had to move it 50 feet to the south, but close enough that I could still access the island and Grandpa's treehouse. I used the same design, the same techniques he'd taught me all those years ago. The only difference was the plaque I installed at the midpoint. In memory of Joseph Thompson, who believed some things should be built to last, and Thomas Thompson, who learned that some things are worth tearing down. Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to expose the truth. Jessica Martinez helped me sue the development company and won a settlement that covered all my legal costs and then some. The money was nice, but what I really wanted was justice. The executives who'd authorized dumping industrial waste in a quarry and then covering it with water to create a luxury community amenity got jail time. Margaret Hensley got 5 years in federal prison and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association board. Her son-in-law's development company went bankrupt, paying for cleanup costs and victim compensation. I still live in the same house, still wake up every morning to the sight of the lake. But it's different now. The water is cleaner, the fish are healthier, and the bridge that connects my property to the island carries more than just foot traffic. It carries the weight of truth finally revealed. Sometimes I sit in Grandpa's old treehouse, looking out over the water, and I think about the conversation we never got to have. The one where he would have told me about the documents hidden behind the loose board, about the choice he faced between speaking up and protecting his family, about the burden of carrying secrets that could destroy lives. I understand now why he kept quiet. In 1978, environmental protection was still a new concept. Whistleblower protections were weak. A working-class man taking on county officials and big business was David facing Goliath, except David didn't have a legal system that would back him up. But I also understand that times change. The tools available to fight corruption and environmental crimes are stronger now. The public awareness is higher. The legal precedents are established. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory isn't to protect the things they built, but to finish the fight they couldn't win. The new HOA, formed after the old board was dissolved in disgrace, asked me to serve as president. I declined. I've seen what power can do to people, how it can corrupt good intentions and turn neighbors against each other. Instead, I serve on the Environmental Oversight Committee. We test the lake water monthly. We maintain detailed records of all community activities that might affect local ecosystems. We've established a policy that all major decisions require environmental impact assessments and full disclosure to residents. We will never again let anyone hide toxic secrets under the pretty surface of community life. The story made national news eventually. HOA harassment exposes 30-year environmental cover-up. Homeowners' bridge dispute reveals Superfund site. The man who drained a lake to find the truth. Reporters wanted to paint me as either a hero or a villain, depending on their angle. Environmental advocates called me a crusader for justice. Property rights groups claimed I'd destroyed a community out of spite. The truth, as always, was more complicated. I didn't set out to expose environmental crimes or take down corrupt officials. I just wanted to protect my grandfather's bridge, to preserve a piece of family history that connected me to the man who'd raised me and the values he tried to teach me. But sometimes protecting what matters most means tearing down the lies that surround it. Sometimes the only way to build something lasting is to destroy the rotten foundation beneath it. And sometimes when people in power try to silence you, the best response isn't to fight back. It's to drain the lake and show the world what they've been trying so desperately to hide. The new bridge is stronger than the old one. It has to be, because it's carrying not just the weight of foot traffic but the weight of truth. And truth, as my grandfather might have said if he'd lived to see this day, is the one thing that's really built to last. Every morning when I walk across that bridge to check on the treehouse, I can feel him there with me. Not in some supernatural sense, but in the solid planks beneath my feet, in the careful joints that will hold for another 60 years, in the knowledge that some promises are worth keeping even when, especially when, keeping them requires courage you didn't know you had. The lake is beautiful now. Truly beautiful, not just pretty on the surface while hiding corruption underneath. Fish jump in the early morning light, birds nest in the reeds along the shore, and children play in water that won't slowly poison them over decades of exposure. That's what victory looks like. Not revenge, not destruction, but truth exposed to sunlight and clean water flowing free. And a bridge that will stand for generations, connecting not just two pieces of land, but the past to the present, secrets to revelations, and the memory of a good man to the legacy he never knew he was leaving behind.